3 days after leaving the orphanage, Clara Bennett inherited a forgotten forest house from a grandfather she had never met. She thought it was just an abandoned cabin hidden deep in the Montana woods. But behind a sealed wall inside that house, she uncovered a terrifying 70-year-old secret the entire town had spent decades trying to bury. Missing workers, hidden letters, a collapsed mountain, and one chilling message carved directly into the wood. Not all of them stayed below. What Clara discovered inside that cabin didn't just change her past. It revealed the horrifying reason she was abandoned as a child, and why her grandfather spent his entire life protecting the truth. And before this story ends, Clara will uncover something so devastating, it will change the way she sees her family forever. At first, Clara Bennett didn't believe the letter was real. She read it 3 times while sitting on the narrow bed inside the orphanage dormitory, the afternoon rain ticking softly against the windows. The envelope was thick, addressed in faded blue ink, with a return address from a law office 2 states away. According to the letter, a man named Samuel Carter had died 6 weeks earlier, and somehow he had left everything to her. Clara had never heard his name before. 3 days later, she stepped off a rusted bus at the edge of Black Hollow, Montana, carrying a single suitcase and a coat too thin for the mountain wind. The town looked half asleep beneath a gray sky, empty storefronts, power lines humming softly overhead, a diner with one flickering sign. The driver pointed her toward an old logging road disappearing into the trees. "That house up there," he muttered quietly. "Most folks stay away from it." The forest swallowed the road almost immediately. Tall pines crowded close together, blocking the sunlight. Gravel cracked beneath her boots as she followed the path deeper uphill until finally, through the fog and branches, she saw it. A weathered cabin standing alone among the trees. Dark windows, sagging porch, smoke stains climbing the stone chimney. The place didn't look abandoned. It looked like it was waiting. Clara didn't unpack anything that first evening. There wasn't much to unpack anyway, just a faded suitcase, 2 sweaters, a paperback novel with water-damaged pages, and a small silver locket she'd owned since childhood. The locket had no photograph inside. It never had. She placed it carefully on the windowsill beside the sink. The cabin was colder than she expected. Not freezing, just hollow. The kind of cold that settles into old wood after years without voices. Most of the furniture remained untouched. A wool blanket draped across the couch. A lantern resting near the fireplace. A pair of cracked leather boots positioned neatly beside the door, as if someone had intended to wear them again. Nothing looked abandoned, only paused. Clara moved quietly through the rooms without turning on the lights. The fading daylight slipping through the dusty curtains was enough to guide her steps. The air smelled of cedar, smoke, and old paper. In the front room, a long table stood beneath the window covered with stacks of newspapers tied together with twine. Some dated back decades. Headlines about logging accidents, missing hikers, forest fires, mine closures. One paper caught her eye. Black Hollow Timber. Crew vanishes during storm. The article had been clipped carefully, folded, kept. Clara stared at it longer than she meant to. 9 workers missing. No bodies recovered. Search suspended after 2 weeks. The date at the top read October 14th, 1954. A chill moved slowly through her stomach. She folded the clipping back into place. At the rear of the cabin, a narrow hallway led toward a closed room. Unlike the rest of the house, this door looked newer, reinforced. The brass handle resisted when she turned it, then suddenly released. Inside was a study. The room was smaller than she expected. A wooden desk faced a rain-fogged window overlooking nothing but pine trees. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, crowded with books, journals, and cardboard file boxes labeled in faded ink. The air felt heavier here, not threatening, just occupied. A dark wool coat still hung behind the door. A coffee mug sat beside the desk, stained brown at the bottom. A pair of reading glasses rested on an open notebook as though Samuel Carter had simply stepped outside for a moment. Clara sat carefully in the desk chair. It creaked beneath her weight. For reasons she couldn't explain, she lowered her voice before speaking aloud. "Who were you?" The room offered no answer, only silence and the sound of distant wind pressing against the cabin walls. She opened the top drawer. Inside were pencils sharpened down almost to nothing, a rusted pocket knife, loose receipts from the town grocery store, and beneath them, a folded map. The paper crackled softly as she opened it. It wasn't modern, no highways, no county routes, just hand-drawn trails winding through dense forest and mountain ridges marked in faded red ink. One area had been circled repeatedly, East Ridge. The words were written by hand beside a symbol Clara didn't recognize. Below it, in smaller lettering, "Restricted after collapse." Her fingers paused against the page. Collapse. She leaned closer. Thin pencil markings covered the margins like someone had been tracking measurements or directions, elevations, coordinates, notes too faded to fully read. Then she noticed something else. A second sheet tucked beneath the map. A photograph. Black and white. 9 men standing shoulder to shoulder outside a logging tunnel carved directly into the mountainside. Their faces were dirty, tired, young. One man stood slightly apart from the others. Tall, broad shoulders, dark coat. On the back of the photograph, written in careful handwriting, "Samuel Carter, October 1954. Clara's throat tightened unexpectedly. It was the first time she had ever seen his face. She studied it for a long moment. He wasn't smiling, but there was something in his expression that unsettled her. Not fear. Responsibility. Outside, a branch scraped suddenly against the window. Clara flinched. The sound faded just as quickly. She exhaled slowly and slid the photograph back onto the desk. That was when her hand brushed against something hidden beneath the drawer lining. A hard edge. She frowned and pressed her fingers deeper into the corner. The wood shifted slightly. A soft click echoed beneath the desk. Clara froze. For a second, nothing happened. Then somewhere behind her, a faint hollow sound. She stood immediately and turned toward the back wall. At first, everything looked normal. Bookshelves, wood paneling, dust. But then she noticed it. 3 iron nails positioned lower than the others near the floorboards. Cleaner, less rusted. Out of place. Slowly. She stepped closer. The air felt different here. Cooler. She crouched and pressed lightly against the wooden panel between the nails. Another click. A narrow seam appeared in the wall. Clara's pulse quickened. The hidden panel didn't swing open fully. It shifted only an inch before stopping, releasing a thin breath of stale air from whatever lay behind it. Darkness waited inside. She stared at the opening without moving. Every instinct told her to step away, to close it, to leave the room, to pretend she had never found it. But another feeling rose quietly beneath the fear. Curiosity. The kind that grows slowly after a lifetime without answers. Clara reached beside the desk and grabbed the lantern resting near the bookshelf. Her hands trembled slightly as she lit it. The flame flickered weakly at first, then steadied. Carefully, she pulled the hidden panel wider. Dust drifted through the narrow beam of light. Behind the wall was a shallow storage space lined with rough plywood, and inside, a metal lockbox. Old black, scratched deeply across the surface, as though someone had tried very hard to open it once before. Clara stared at it without breathing. The cabin around her had gone completely silent. Even the wind outside seemed to stop. She stepped closer, then noticed something carved faintly into the wood beside the box. 3 words, written by hand. Do not forget. Clara didn't open the lockbox right away. She carried it carefully from the hidden compartment and placed it on the desk beneath the lantern light. Dust coated the metal surface in pale gray streaks. The corners were scarred deeply, as though someone had once tried prying it apart with tools. The cabin felt unnaturally quiet. Not peaceful? Listening? Clara ran her fingers along the lid until she found the latch. It wasn't locked anymore, just stiff with age. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she lifted it open. Inside were papers, dozens of them. Folded documents tied with twine, weather-stained envelopes, photographs curled at the edges, and beneath everything else, a leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked almost down the center. Samuel Carter. The name was pressed faintly into the leather. Clara swallowed hard and opened to the first page. The handwriting inside was careful and narrow, written with the kind of precision people use when they're afraid of forgetting something important. October 3rd, 1954. They closed the North Trail again today. Said the mountain shifted after the rain. But the men know that's not true anymore. Clara read the sentence twice. A cold heaviness settled slowly in her chest. She turned the page. 2 workers refused to go back below after what happened near Shaft C. They claimed they heard knocking beneath the rock long after the collapse. Another page. Management says panic spreads faster than truth. Then another. 3 names removed from payroll today. No reports filed. Clara's breathing slowed. The journal didn't read like a diary. It read like evidence. Outside, thunder rolled faintly somewhere deep beyond the forest. Rain began tapping softly against the roof. She kept reading. The sheriff visited tonight, told us to stop asking questions, said the families were already suffering enough. Someone sealed the eastern tunnel before sunrise. They're hiding the numbers. Clara stopped. Numbers. She flipped forward faster now, pages whispering beneath her fingers. Then, one entry had been underlined repeatedly. October 18th, 1954. There were 9 men inside East Ridge when the tunnel collapsed. Only 4 bodies were recovered. The others were left beneath. Clara stared at the words until they blurred. The room suddenly felt smaller. Airless. She looked up instinctively toward the dark windows of the cabin. The forest outside had disappeared behind heavy rain and blackness. For the first time since arriving, she felt completely alone. Her eyes dropped back to the journal. Beneath the entry, Samuel had written one final sentence in darker ink. They told us to bury the story with the mountain. A sharp knock exploded against the front door. Clara jerked violently in her chair. The lantern flame flickered. Another knock followed. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Her heart slammed against her ribs. No one should have been out here. Not this late. The storm outside intensified, wind rattling branches against the roof as Clara stood carefully from the desk. The knocking came again. 3 times. She crossed the hallway slowly, every floorboard groaning beneath her feet. The cabin suddenly felt far too large around her. At the front door, she hesitated, then opened it slightly. An older man stood beneath the rain wearing a dark canvas coat and a soaked hat pulled low over his forehead. His face was lined deeply with age, but his eyes were sharp. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then the man glanced past her shoulder toward the cabin interior. "You, Samuel's granddaughter?" he asked quietly. Clara tightened her grip on the door. "I guess so." The man nodded once, like he had expected that answer. "My name's Walter Grady," he said, "sheriff around here a long time ago." Lightning flashed behind the trees, illuminating the forest in brief silver light. Walter's expression hardened slightly. "You shouldn't stay here alone," he said. Clara frowned. "Why?" The old man looked toward the woods before answering. "Because people around Black Hollow spent 70 years pretending certain things never happened." The storm groaned overhead. Clara opened the door wider. Walter stepped inside slowly, removing his hat. Rainwater dripped onto the wooden floorboards. His eyes moved immediately toward the study hallway, toward the hidden room. He noticed the lantern glow. Then the open journal resting on the desk. His face changed. Not surprise. Recognition. "You found it," he said quietly. Clara crossed her arms instinctively. "You knew about this." Walter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked slowly toward the fireplace, staring into the dying embers inside. "My father worked East Ridge," he finally said. "Most men in this town did." Clara felt her stomach tighten. "The journal says 9 men died." Walter shook his head slowly. "No," he said. His voice lowered. 12. The room went completely still. Clara stared at him. But the reports were altered. Thunder cracked violently overhead. Walter looked older suddenly, tired in a way that seemed to reach beneath his skin. The company sealed the tunnel before the rescue crews finished searching. He continued quietly, said the mountain was unstable. Truth was, they didn't want inspectors digging around up there. Clara's chest tightened. "Why?" Walter looked directly at her now. "Because the collapse wasn't natural." The words landed heavily between them. Rain hammered the roof harder. Clara barely noticed. Walter reached slowly into his coat pocket and removed a folded photograph. He handed it to her carefully. Another black and white image. This one showed the same group of workers standing near the ridge entrance. But now Clara noticed something different. Behind them, crates, metal equipment, fuel drums, dynamite. Walter pointed toward the image. They were blasting deeper into unstable ground after Samuel warned them to stop. Clara looked up sharply. He tried to stop it. Walter nodded once. He fought them for weeks. Silence swallowed the room again. Then Walter added quietly, "Your grandfather spent the rest of his life carrying what happened up there." Clara looked toward the journal on the desk, toward the hidden compartment in the wall, toward the storm pressing against the windows. And slowly, horribly, she realized something. Samuel Carter hadn't hidden these records from the world because he was ashamed. He hid them because someone wanted them buried. Forever. The lantern flame flickered violently as another gust of wind shook the cabin. Then suddenly, the power came on. One overhead bulb flashed to life in the hallway. Dim, buzzing, weak with age, but enough. Enough for Clara to notice something she hadn't seen before. Written faintly across the study wall beside the hidden compartment. A line carved directly into the wood. Not all of them stayed below. Clara stopped breathing. Walter saw it too, and for the first time since entering the cabin, the old sheriff looked afraid. Clara didn't sleep that night. The storm lingered over Black Hollow for hours, rattling the cabin windows and groaning through the pine trees like something moving unseen in the dark. Even after Walter Grady left, the silence never fully returned. It changed. The cabin no longer felt abandoned. It felt inhabited by memory. Clara sat alone in the study with Samuel Carter's journal open beside her. The lantern burned low now, casting soft shadows across the walls. Outside, rainwater slid slowly down the windows like fading lines of ink. Her eyes kept returning to the words carved beside the hidden compartment. Not all of them stayed below. She didn't know what the sentence meant, not completely, but it had settled somewhere deep inside her. Before arriving in Black Hollow, Clara had spent most of her life believing silence meant absence, empty rooms, missing people, questions nobody bothered answering. The orphanage had taught her that. Children stopped asking where they came from after enough years passed without answers. Eventually, silence became easier, safer. But this place was different. The silence here wasn't empty. It was crowded. Crowded with things left unsaid. Near dawn, Clara closed the journal and stepped onto the porch. Fog drifted low through the trees, while pale gray light spread slowly across the mountains. The storm had passed. Everything smelled of wet pine and earth. For a long moment, she simply stood there, listening. Birds somewhere distant, water dripping from the roof, wind moving gently through branches, and beneath all of it, stillness, not frightening anymore, just patient. Her eyes drifted east toward the ridge hidden somewhere beyond the forest. The sealed tunnel, the buried names, the mountain that had swallowed 12 men while the town spent 70 years pretending otherwise. Clara wrapped her coat tighter around herself, then quietly whispered into the morning air. What happened up there? The forest gave no answer, but for the first time, she realized she wasn't asking because she was afraid. She was asking because she cared. Later that morning, she returned to the study and began sorting through the contents of the lockbox more carefully. The documents weren't random. Samuel had organized everything deliberately. Inspection reports, worker schedules, letters never mailed, handwritten testimonies folded inside old envelopes. One paper stopped her immediately, a payroll sheet. 12 names listed, but only 9 names appeared in the official newspaper clipping downstairs. 3 had been erased, not crossed out, removed completely. Clara stared at the page for several seconds before reaching for another document beneath it. This one was handwritten. October 21st, 1954. They told the families the mountain took 9. But we know better. 3 were still alive after the collapse. We heard them knocking for 2 days. Clara's chest tightened painfully. 2 days. Her eyes moved lower across the page. Samuel tried to force the crews back in, but the company shut the tunnel before dawn. Said further excavation would expose the instability reports. At the bottom of the letter, one sentence had been written in darker ink. We buried men who were still waiting to come home. Clara closed her eyes. A strange numbness spread through her arms. Not shock, something heavier. Recognition. All her life, she had imagined abandonment as a sudden thing. A door closing. Someone leaving. But this was abandonment chosen deliberately. Signed, approved, buried beneath paperwork and silence. She stood abruptly and walked toward the kitchen, breathing unevenly. The cabin suddenly felt too small to contain what she had learned. She filled the kettle with water and lit the propane burner with shaking hands. Outside the window, fog drifted slowly between the trees. The forest looked softer in daylight, older, as though it had witnessed everything and simply continued growing around it. Clara leaned both hands against the counter, and unexpectedly, she thought about Samuel Carter, not as a mystery, not as a stranger, but as a man forced to live with something unbearable. She pictured him alone in this cabin year after year, keeping records nobody wanted, writing letters nobody answered, listening to a town bury the truth deeper every season. Suddenly, the hidden compartment made sense. The journals, the photographs, the maps. He hadn't been preserving evidence. He had been preserving people. The realization changed something inside her. When Clara first arrived at the cabin, she had viewed everything as temporary, a strange inheritance, an interruption before returning to the life she already knew. But standing there now, listening to the kettle begin its low whistle, she understood something quietly devastating. There had never really been a life waiting for her elsewhere. No family, no history, and no place that remembered her. And somehow, impossibly, this forgotten cabin in the woods had become the first place that ever had. By afternoon, Clara found herself walking toward East Ridge, not searching for proof, not trying to uncover more secrets, just trying to understand why Samuel stayed. The trail was barely visible beneath layers of wet leaves and broken branches. The deeper she walked into the forest, the quieter everything became, until finally, she saw it. The ridge rose from the trees like the spine of something ancient. Moss covered most of the stone face now, but near the center she could still make out the shape of the sealed tunnel entrance. Concrete, steel bolts, collapsed rock. Nature had spent decades trying to erase it, but not completely. Clara approached slowly. The air felt colder here. She stopped several feet from the entrance and studied the dark stains running down the rock surface. Rainwater, or time. She couldn't tell anymore. Then she noticed something near the base of the ridge. Small objects, half buried beneath moss and dirt. Flowers. Old ones. Left there long ago. Someone had been coming here. Maybe for years. Clara crouched slowly beside them. Most had decayed completely, but one object remained untouched by weather. A child's marble. Blue glass, swirled white inside. She picked it up carefully, and suddenly understood. The town had never truly forgotten. People had simply learned to grieve quietly. The wind moved softly through the trees above her. Clara looked toward the sealed tunnel one final time, then slipped the marble gently into her coat pocket. Not as evidence, as memory, and somewhere deep inside her, the fear that had followed her since arriving in Black Hollow finally began to loosen its grip. Because this place no longer felt haunted. It felt unfinished. The ridge stayed with Clara long after she returned to the cabin. Not the tunnel itself, not the collapsed stone or rusted bolts buried beneath moss. It was the flowers. The realization that someone else had been climbing that trail all these years without speaking about it. Someone had remembered. That thought settled quietly inside her over the following days. The cabin no longer felt like a place she was borrowing. It felt shared, not with ghosts, with echoes. Clara began opening the windows each morning now. Fresh mountain air moved through the rooms, carrying the scent of pine and rain-soaked earth. Dust shifted gently in the sunlight that crossed the floorboards. The house seemed lighter. Or maybe she was. She spent hours organizing Samuel Carter's papers across the study table. At first, the documents had looked chaotic old receipts mixed with inspection reports. Letters stacked beside photographs, but slowly patterns began to emerge. Dates repeated. Names resurfaced. And one signature appeared more than any other. A Duncan Hale, the owner of the Black Hollow Timber Operations. Every safety complaint Samuel had filed carried Hale's approval stamp at the bottom. Denied. No further action required. Continue operations. Clara stared at the pages in silence. One document in particular caught her attention. October 16, 1954. Structural instability confirmed beneath East Ridge Access Tunnel. Continued blasting may result in catastrophic collapse. signed Samuel Carter. Beneath it, another signature written sharply in darker ink. Proceed as scheduled. D. Hale. Clara exhaled slowly. For 70 years, the town had carried the weight of a disaster someone chose to ignore. And somehow, Samuel had carried it longer than anyone. That afternoon, Clara drove into town for the first time since arriving. Black Hollow looked different now. Not smaller, sadder. The buildings along Main Street leaned with age beneath faded signs and peeling paint. Most storefronts were quiet except for the general store near the corner, where crates of apples and canned goods sat beneath a striped awning. A small brass bell rang softly as she stepped inside. An older woman behind the counter glanced up from sorting receipts. Her silver hair was tied loosely behind her neck, and deep lines framed her calm eyes. "You must be Samuel's granddaughter," she said gently. Clara blinked in surprise. "How did you know?" The woman smiled faintly. "Town this size, everybody notices when someone finally goes back up to that cabin." Clara nodded awkwardly. The woman extended her hand. Margaret Bell. Her handshake was warm. Steady. Clara found herself relaxing slightly. Margaret studied her for a moment before speaking again. "You look like your grandmother." Clara's chest tightened unexpectedly. "No one's ever said that before." Margaret's expression softened. "She was kind," she said quietly. "Too kind for the things this town asked people to live with." The words lingered between them. Clara hesitated before finally asking, "Did you know what happened at East Ridge?" The store grew still. Even the old refrigerator humming near the back seemed quieter somehow. Margaret lowered her eyes briefly toward the counter, then nodded. "Most of us did," she admitted softly. Clara felt her throat tighten, but nobody said anything. Margaret gave a tired smile. In small towns, silence becomes a survival skill. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then Margaret disappeared briefly into the back room before returning with a paper bag filled with bread, canned soup, and a small jar of homemade blackberry preserves. Clara frowned. "I didn't order." "I know," Margaret interrupted gently. "Samuel used to come in every Thursday evening, bought the exact same things." She placed the bag carefully into Clara's hands. Figured the cabin shouldn't feel empty yet. The kindness in her voice nearly undid something inside Clara. She thanked her quietly before leaving. Outside, late afternoon sunlight stretched long across the empty street. For the first time since arriving in Black Hollow, Clara noticed people watching her differently. Not suspiciously, curiously, like they were waiting to see whether she would stay. When she returned to the cabin, something felt different immediately. The front door was slightly open. Only an inch, but enough. Clara froze. Her pulse quickened instantly. She knew she had locked it. Slowly, she stepped onto the porch. The forest around the cabin stood silent beneath the fading light. No movement, no sound. Carefully, she pushed the door open wider. The cabin interior looked untouched at first glance. The study lamp still glowed softly. The papers remained spread across the desk. Nothing overturned, yet the air felt disturbed somehow. Clara stepped inside cautiously, then stopped. On the study table, resting directly atop Samuel's journal, a photograph she had never seen before. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. It showed East Ridge before the collapse. Dozens of workers stood near the tunnel entrance beside trucks and blasting equipment. But that wasn't what made her breath catch. Near the edge of the photograph stood a young woman holding the hand of a small child. The woman looked painfully familiar. Same eyes, same jawline. Clara turned the photograph over slowly. On the back, written carefully in faded ink, Eleanor Carter and daughter. Summer, 1952. Clara stared at the words without moving. Daughter? Her mother? The room tilted slightly around her. She had spent her entire life believing she came from nowhere. No family history, no roots, no explanation why she ended up abandoned at an orphanage 6 states away. But suddenly, the silence surrounding her life wasn't empty anymore. It was hidden. Her eyes moved lower across the back of the photograph. Another sentence had been added beneath the names. If anything happens, keep her away from Black Hollow. Clara's heartbeat slowed painfully, because for the first time, she understood. Someone hadn't abandoned her. Someone had tried to protect her. Outside, wind moved softly through the trees as dusk settled over the mountain. Clara lowered herself slowly into Samuel's chair, holding the photograph tightly in both hands, and somewhere deep beneath the grief, beneath the confusion, beneath the 70 years of buried silence, something new began to grow. Not fear, not anger, belonging. Clara began waking before sunrise. At first, it wasn't intentional. The cabin simply had its own rhythm, one that ignored clocks and calendars. The wind moved differently before dawn. The floorboards settled softly in the cold, somewhere beyond the trees. Birds called into the darkness long before light reached the mountains. Eventually, Clara stopped trying to fall back asleep. She would rise quietly, wrap herself in Samuel's old wool sweater, and sit near the kitchen window while water heated on the stove. The mornings no longer felt lonely. They felt shared. Outside, autumn had begun settling over Black Hollow. Pine needles gathered along the porch steps. Fog lingered lower between the trees now, and frost sometimes appeared in thin silver patterns across the cabin windows. Clara noticed everything. The sound of rain moving across the roof before storms arrived. The creak near the hallway whenever temperatures dropped. The way the forest seemed louder at dusk and quieter after midnight. Small things, but for someone who had spent most of her life feeling temporary, small things mattered. The photograph of Eleanor Carter remained on the study desk beside Samuel's journal. Clara had stared at it so many times she nearly memorized every detail. Her mother looked young, tired, protective, and the little girl standing beside her, Clara herself, no older than 3, the realization still unsettled her. All her life, she had imagined abandonment as an ending, but now she understood it may have been an act of desperation instead. Someone had tried to keep her alive. That thought changed how she carried herself inside the cabin. She no longer moved through the rooms like a visitor. She moved carefully, respectfully, as though she was walking through the remains of people who had once loved each other very much. One afternoon, while sorting through another stack of boxes in the study, Clara discovered a narrow tin container hidden beneath old ledgers. Inside were letters, dozens of them, each addressed to the same place, St. Agnes Children's Home. Her breath caught instantly. Hands trembling slightly, she unfolded the first one. March 7th, 1961. To whoever is caring for my granddaughter, I understand these letters may never reach her, but if they do, I need her to know she was loved before she was lost. Clara stopped breathing. The handwriting was unmistakable. Samuel Carter. She lowered herself slowly into the desk chair and continued reading. I was told keeping distance would keep her safe. Perhaps they were right. But there is not a single day I have not thought about bringing her home. A tear slid silently down Clara's cheek before she realized she was crying. She wiped it away quickly, then kept reading. The letters stretched across years, birthdays Samuel had missed, questions he wondered if she asked, stories about the forest, the changing seasons, the cabin she now sat inside. Some letters included drawings, small sketches of birds, trees, mountains. One contained a pressed wildflower taped carefully between pages. None of the letters had ever been mailed. Clara pressed her hand gently against her mouth. The grief she felt wasn't sharp anymore. It was quieter than that. Deeper. Like mourning something that almost existed. By evening, she had read every letter in the box. The last one was dated only 8 months before Samuel's death. If you ever come here one day, I hope the mountain feels less heavy for you than it did for me. I hope you learn that silence and loneliness are not the same thing, and I hope you stay long enough to hear the forest forgive itself. Clara closed her eyes tightly. Outside, wind moved softly through the trees. For a long time, she sat there without speaking. Then, eventually, she rose from the desk and stepped onto the porch. The sky above Black Hollow glowed deep orange beneath the setting sun. Smoke curled from chimneys down in town, somewhere far off. A dog barked once before falling quiet again. The world looked ordinary, but Clara no longer felt separated from it. For the first time in her life, she belonged to something larger than herself, not because she had uncovered secrets, not because she carried Samuel's name, but because people here remembered. The next morning, Margaret Bell arrived unexpectedly carrying a basket covered with cloth. Clara invited her inside. Margaret paused in the study doorway almost immediately when she noticed the letters spread across the desk. Her expression softened. "He kept writing them," she said quietly. Clara looked up sharply. "You knew." Margaret nodded slowly. "He came into the store every winter asking if the orphanage had changed addresses." She smiled sadly. "I don't think he ever stopped hoping someone would tell him it was finally safe." Clara lowered her eyes toward the letters. "Why didn't he come get me?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Margaret remained silent for several seconds. Then she answered gently. "Because after the collapse, strange things started happening around the people who spoke too loudly about East Ridge." A chill moved through Clara. Margaret continued carefully. "Your mother wanted to leave town with you. Samuel helped her disappear." Her voice lowered. "But she died before she could come back." The words settled heavily between them. Clara stared toward the window. The forest beyond the glass looked unchanged, but suddenly she understood why Samuel stayed isolated all those years. He hadn't been hiding from the town. He had been watching over what remained of his family. Margaret stepped closer and rested a hand softly against Clara's shoulder. "He loved you," she said simply. Clara swallowed hard, then nodded once, because finally, she believed it. That evening, Clara climbed the trail to East Ridge again. The forest air smelled of pine and cold earth. Fallen leaves cracked softly beneath her boots as dusk settled between the trees. When she reached the sealed tunnel, she stopped. The mountain stood silent before her, patient, ancient, heavy with memory. Clara reached into her coat pocket and removed one of Samuel's letters. Carefully. She folded it once more and tucked it gently beneath the stone beside the forgotten flowers. Not as proof, not as evidence, as forgiveness. Then she stood there quietly while wind moved through the trees around her. And for the first time since arriving in Black Hollow, the mountain no longer felt like a place hiding something terrible. It felt like a place trying to heal. Winter arrived quietly in Black Hollow. The first snow came late one evening while Clara sat at the study desk reading beside the lantern. She noticed it only when the cabin windows turned white around the edges, and the forest beyond disappeared into falling silence. By morning, the mountain had changed completely. Snow covered the porch rails. The old logging road vanished beneath pale drifts. Even East Ridge, hidden beyond the trees, seemed softened by the season. Clara stood outside wrapped in Samuel's wool coat, watching smoke rise from the chimney into the gray winter sky. The cabin no longer felt unfamiliar. It felt lived in, not restored, not repaired, simply cared for. And somehow that mattered more. Inside, Samuel's journals remained stacked neatly on the study shelves beside the letters he had never sent. Clara hadn't hidden them away, but she no longer spent every night searching through the past either. The story no longer consumed her. It accompanied her, like the mountain itself, steady, present, always there. Some mornings, Margaret stopped by with bread or preserves from town. Other days, Sheriff Walter Grady appeared without warning, standing at the porch with snow gathered across his boots while he talked about weather, broken roads, or the old days before the mines closed. Nobody mentioned East Ridge directly anymore. They didn't need to. The silence surrounding it had changed. It was no longer fear. It was respect. By spring, people in Black Hollow began speaking Samuel Carter's name differently. Not as a recluse, not as the old man in the forest, but as someone who stayed when others looked away. A teacher from the town school eventually visited the cabin one afternoon, carrying a small recorder and a notebook. She asked Clara if the students could learn about the history of East Ridge, not the rumors, but the truth of what happened there. Clara hesitated before answering, then finally nodded. Not because the town needed a scandal, because the men deserved remembrance. Weeks later, a small gathering was held near the edge of the forest. No reporters, no cameras, no speeches prepared in advance. Just people. Old families from Black Hollow stood together beneath the pine trees, while 12 lanterns were placed carefully along the trail leading toward the ridge. One for every worker who never came home. Clara stood quietly near the back while names were read aloud into the evening air. Some belonged to fathers, some to brothers, some to men who had once been almost forgotten entirely. And when Samuel Carter's name was spoken, the crowd fell especially silent. Not because he had caused the tragedy, because he had carried it. Afterward, people lingered beneath the trees, speaking softly among themselves, while lantern light flickered against the darkening forest. Margaret stepped beside Clara and slipped her arm gently through hers. "He would have hated all this attention," she said with a faint smile. Clara laughed softly. "Yes," she admitted, "probably. But deep down, she thought Samuel might have understood. Not the ceremony, not the recognition, the remembering. That part would have mattered to him." Later that night, Clara walked alone toward East Ridge one final time before the snow fully melted from the mountain. The forest was quiet except for the sound of water dripping from branches overhead. When she reached the sealed tunnel, she stopped beside the old stone marker where weathered flowers still rested beneath patches of moss. The mountain looked older now, less frightening, like grief after enough years have passed. She reached into her coat pocket and unfolded the list she had written weeks earlier. 12 names, carefully copied from Samuel's records in her own handwriting. For a long moment, she simply held the paper while cold wind moved gently through the trees. Then she folded it once more and placed it beneath the stone. Not to bury it, to leave it somewhere remembered. Clara stood there until dusk settled across the ridge. And suddenly, she realized something that surprised her. She was no longer angry. Not at the town, not at the silence, not even at the years she had lost wondering why she had been abandoned. Because now she understood. Her life had not begun with abandonment. It had begun with survival. Samuel Carter had spent decades protecting the last pieces of a broken story, so that one day, someone else could carry it forward without fear. And somehow, that someone became her. When Clara finally returned to the cabin, The lights glowing through the windows felt warmer than they ever had before. Home. The word settled gently inside her. Not dramatic, not sudden. Just true. Years later, travelers passing through Black Hollow would sometimes ask about the old cabin deep in the forest. Locals would point toward the mountain road and say, "A woman lives up there now." Some called her quiet. Some called her thoughtful. Some said she knew every trail in the woods better than anyone alive. But the people who truly knew the story said something else. They said the mountain had finally stopped grieving after she arrived. And perhaps in its own way, so had she. Clara Bennett never uncovered treasure. She never solved every mystery hidden beneath East Ridge. Some questions remained unanswered. Some truths always would. But the story had never really been about uncovering the past. It was about refusing to let it disappear. And in the end, that was enough. Clara Bennett came to Black Hollow believing she had no family, no history, and no place to belong. But inside an old forest cabin, she discovered something more powerful than answers. She discovered that silence does not always mean abandonment. For 70 years, Samuel Carter protected the memory of the people lost beneath East Ridge. He carried their story quietly so they would never be forgotten. And in the process, he protected Clara too. The mountain never needed someone to solve its mystery. It only needed someone willing to remember. Sometimes healing doesn't come from changing the past. Sometimes it comes from finally understanding it. Many people spend years carrying pain they never speak about. Old memories, family wounds, questions left unanswered. But healing often begins when we stop running from those things and choose to face them with understanding instead of fear. Not every story needs a perfect ending. Sometimes being seen, remembered, and understood is enough.